Winston Churchill wrote in his history books about World War II that after the Japanese attack on the US Pacific Fleet, quote, Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. The rest was merely the proper application of overwhelming force. Churchill wrote this with full belief in the economic determinist nonsense about Allied victory being inevitable. Despite the fact that Richard Overy debunked the pseudo-historical school of thought in 1994, it persists in the online history community because repeating falsehoods doesn't matter as long as you own the wares. However, less emphasis has been placed on the proper application. There are many examples in history of overwhelming force being improperly applied and the outcomes of armed contests being changed as a result. As I hope to show you, the Italian campaigns in the Mediterranean Sea and North Africa at the beginning of World War II fall into this category. Il Duce was dealt an excellent hand when he entered the war in 1940, but misplayed it so badly that in less than 5 years, the fascist dictator was hanging upside down in Milan. In this video, I will discuss two targets of Italian imperialism, Malta and Egypt. The conquest of these territories, without assistance from Nazi Germany, was feasible at the beginning of the war. Because Adolf Hitler was too focused on trying to destroy Russia to perceive the strategic opportunities offered to the Axis in the Mediterranean, it was up to Mussolini to seize them, something he could have done in 1940. Here's how. Ever since the fascist regime came to power, Malta had been a prime target of Italian imperialism. Mussolini stated in a memorandum written on March 31st, 1940 that, quote, Italy will not truly be an independent nation until it possesses the bars of its Mediterranean prison, Corsica, Bizerta, Malta, and the walls of the same prison, Gibraltar, and Suez, end quote. Yet from the moment Italy joined the Axis on June 10, 1940 to the moment Mussolini was removed from power on July 25, 1943, Malta was never once invaded by either Italy or Germany. This was not because of the strength of British defenses on the island. When Poland was invaded in September 1939, Italy remained neutral. The priority of the Royal Navy was assisting France in the Atlantic Ocean against Germany. Even when Italy seemed to be approaching war in April, the British Mediterranean fleet was stationed not in Malta, but in Alexandria, Egypt. The only naval defenses Malta had when Italy entered the war was the monitor HMS Terror and a few submarines. Air and ground defenses were similarly weak because the chiefs of staff of the Army and the Royal Air Force believed the island, a mere 60 miles south of Sicily, was indefensible. In June 1940, Malta possessed a mere 5,000 troops and 3 outdated biplanes. It was also not because the Italians didn't start the war with any plans for invading the island. In 1938, Mussolini developed Plan DG-10/42, in which a 40,000-strong force supported by the Italian Navy and 500 aircraft would take possession of Malta. Historically, Mussolini ordered bombings of Malta hours after entering the war. Had he ordered an invasion of the island instead, it almost certainly would have succeeded. In the words of Charles A. Jellison, quote, When the Duce finally decided to join the conflict, he could have seized Malta before lunch if he had chosen to do so. The annexation of Malta alone would have drastically changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean in favor of the Axis. The British fleets at Gibraltar and Alexandria would have been separated from each other, ensuring the naval superiority Italy gained after the fall of France. The supply line through the Mediterranean would have been completely cut, forcing all British convoys to sail around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. Meanwhile, Italy's supply line to Libya would have been secured, unable to be threatened by British submarines operating out of Malta. If Irvin Rommel's campaign in North Africa still occurred, the Africa Corps' supply issues would have been alleviated with Malta in Italian hands, which could have led to the fall of Egypt and the Suez Canal. Historically, when Tobruk was recaptured in June 1942, Churchill faced a vote of no confidence that he thankfully managed to defeat. Minister of Information Brendan Bracken remarked on the future of the North African campaign that, quote, If we are beaten in this battle, it's the end of Winston. Had the Suez fallen, Churchill could have been removed from power and Britain might have made peace with the Axis. Without the British Isles as a base of operations, it's difficult to see how the United States could have landed in France, Italy, or Morocco. Even the atomic bombs, had they not been used against Japan, would have been useless against Germany without an airbase close enough for a B-29 to carry one over Berlin. With no threats from the West, Hitler would have been free to turn his attention toward the destruction of Russia. Thousands of additional tanks, aircraft, and motor vehicles, along with 500,000 men, could have been sent east and turned the tide in Hitler's favor. With the addition of the historical production advantage Germany gained over Russia in 1944, it is doubtful that Stalin could have won the war by himself. More likely, the Americans would have been forced to concentrate on the Pacific, while Germany emerged the master of Europe. Even if Rommel had still lost in North Africa, Italian possession of Malta would have made an Allied invasion of Sicily more difficult, potentially even impossible. Why, if an Italian invasion of Malta in 1940 would have succeeded, did it not take place, however? The Royal Italian Navy's leadership was excessively cautious, preferring to maintain a quote-unquote fleet in being. Pussy! In theory, this meant preserving the Navy's strength until an opportune moment to use it. In practice, this meant never using the Navy's strength, effectively eliminating it from the Mediterranean order of battle. Following Taranto in November 1940 and the loss of half of Italy's battleships, this conservatism was further entrenched and Italian naval supremacy in the Mediterranean was lost. During the Civil War, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston used his army in a similar conservative manner, and as a result suffered repeated losses in the Peninsula and Atlanta campaigns. Mussolini himself was a bum-ass hoe who didn't want to put in the work necessary to fulfill his Neo-Roman Empire LARP. He famously stated before entering the war that, quote, "I only need a few thousand dead so I can sit at the peace conference as a man who has fought." He expected to be handed Allied colonial possessions without a fight once London either made peace or was subjugated by Hitler. This can be demonstrated in the planning for the Italian invasion of Egypt that almost ended in the loss of Libya. It was initially planned to coincide with Hitler's anticipated invasion of Britain in July 1940, but had no defined endpoint with only limited tactical objectives planned, further showing that Mussolini wanted to piggyback off Hitler's successes. Once it became clear that London would remain swastika-free, it was rescheduled for August, only to be rescheduled again in September due to the summer heat. In the invasion of Egypt, the Axis, not the Allies, held the overwhelming force. The 306 Italian planes in Libya were more than the 205 British aircraft in the entire Middle East, with excellent biplane fighters such as the CR-42 that were superior to the Gloucester Gladiators. The Italians also had around 220,000 troops in Libya, compared to around 86,000 British troops in the entire Middle East, 36,000 of which were in Egypt. This massive disparity in manpower, equipment, and materiel in 1940 was due to the fact that protecting the British Isles from the anticipated German invasion was prioritized over protecting Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the Middle Eastern oil fields. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, the Governor-General of Libya, was in theory not a bad choice to lead the invasion. He had previously fought in World War I, committed genocide in Libya, and gained the nickname the Butcher of Ethiopia during Italy's conquest of that country. It was during the latter war, while serving as Italian Somalia's governor, that he laid the groundwork for an Italian motorized doctrine. Initially tasked with a defensive effort, Graziani went beyond the call of duty and assembled a motorized force to force the Ethiopians to fight on two fronts. In the desert plateau of the Somali region, Italian motorized columns had immense space to maneuver and outflank the Ethiopian forces. Graziani had recognized the same fundamental truth about desert warfare that Rommel did years later in North Africa, that, quote, "Non-motorized troops are of practically no value against a motorized enemy, since the enemy has the chance, in almost every position, to make the action fluid by a turning movement. Non-motorized formations, which can only be used against a modern army defensively in prepared positions, will disturb him very little in such an operation." This doctrine was further developed in the Spanish Civil War, which the Italians intervened in on the side of the nationalist dictator Francisco Franco. At the Battle of Malaga in 1937, the thinly scattered Republican defenses allowed General Mario Roata's motorized forces to rapidly rout the Republican army and seize the city. By the end of the war, the War of Rapid Decision had been developed. Its foundation was based on a rejection of the older Italian doctrine to win by simply throwing numbers at the enemy, which had been done by the military leaders on both sides in World War I, instead emphasizing flank attacks. This was an embodiment of one of Sun Tzu's fundamental axioms that, quote, "Just as flowing water avoids the heights and hastens to the lowlands, so an army avoids strength and strikes weakness." In the desert climate of North Africa, the War of Rapid Decision could shine, just as it had in southern Ethiopia. Graziani had the means to fully motorize two divisions of the Italian 10th Army, combined with artillery support and light and medium tanks, to create a mechanized force to invade Egypt. Once Sollum on the Libyan-Egyptian border had been occupied by infantry divisions, they could have marched along the coast to seize Sidi Barrani 60 miles to the east. All of this was done historically within the first week of the invasion in the face of little British resistance. From here, the main objective would have been the 7th Armored Division in Mersa Martra, the only British motorized force in the Middle East. While the infantry formed what Sun Tzu described as the Chang, or normal force, the mechanized force, approaching Mersa Martra from the south along the Deir al-Hamra Bir ar-Rabia Bur Emba track, would form the Chi, or extraordinary force. Italian armor could then flank the British defenders, cut their lines of communication, and force a surrender. With immense numerical superiority on the ground and in the air, with no British armor to oppose him, Graziani could have effortlessly swept through Egypt, Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, and Kuwait. If Malta had been seized, which was certainly feasible as discussed earlier, supplying the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean would have been impossible, transforming it into an Italian lake. Invading Greece and Yugoslavia would have become unnecessary, since the two nations would have been compelled to submit without hope of British assistance. With Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria joining the Axis, Germany and Italy could have secured the Balkans without needing to commit any soldiers to the peninsula. All of these factors would have converged around neutral Turkey, which could now be approached from Bulgaria in the west and from Syria and Iraq in the south. The Turks would have been isolated from British assistance and sandwiched between the Axis and the Russians. Given the centuries-long rivalry between Turkey and Russia that continued after the war, Turkey would have likely joined the Axis powers. With Turkish participation in Operation Barbarossa, Germany could have advanced from the south to seize the Russian oil fields in the Caucasus and along the western shore of the Caspian Sea. The loss of this oil would have rendered the Red Army unable to fuel itself, leaving little opposition to Hitler's genocidal designs on the Russian people. Without the addition of Russian strength, it is difficult to see how the British, even with assistance from the United States, could have liberated Europe from Axis control on their own. The Allies recognized how vulnerable they would have been if the Middle East had fallen. Churchill told President Roosevelt that continuation of the war under such circumstances, quote, would be a hard, long, and bleak proposition, end quote, even with American entry. The Plan Dog Memorandum of November 1940 stated that, quote, should Egypt be lost, the eastern Mediterranean will be open to Germany and Italy, the effectiveness of the sea blockade will be largely nullified, Turkey's military position will be fully compromised, and all hope of favorable Russian action would vanish. Any anti-German offensive in the Near East would then become impossible. Under these circumstances, Mussolini would have controlled an empire stretching from Tripoli to Kuwait City. The post-war affairs of this empire are not relevant to this video, but given the unlimited amount of oil that would have been under fascist control, Italy would have held immense influence in world affairs during the second half of the 20th century. However, Graziani did not utilize the War of Rapid Decision in North Africa despite the desert being an ideal place to use it. He reverted to the traditional Italian doctrine of overwhelming the enemy with superior numbers, advancing infantry slowly along the coast with a caution characteristic of Italy's military leadership in the face of little resistance. 60 miles into Egypt, he halted at Sidi Barrani and for 3 months did not attempt to advance against the British at Mersa Martra. This gave the British sufficient time to reinforce their position in Egypt, including 3 armored regiments rushed there from the home islands on Churchill's orders. During Operation Compass in December 1940, the British threw the Italians out of Egypt and nearly took Libya itself by February 1941. Why didn't Graziani utilize the War of Rapid Decision? The Italians certainly had their fair share of issues maintaining an army in North Africa, but so did the British at this stage. The reason might have been racial in nature. Graziani's previous battle against a European opponent with technological parity was against Austria-Hungary in World War I. That war was characterized by the overwhelming strength of the defense that discouraged offensive action. Although the War of Rapid Decision had proved effective in Ethiopia, his technologically inferior enemies did not possess weaponized aircraft and were frequently armed with spears. Against the British, who although numerically inferior, were white and possessed comparable technology, Graziani displayed no boldness in his actions. Cold feet in the heat of the Sahara proved to be Italy's undoing, and once the Africa Corps arrived in Libya, Italy's participation in the war as an independent power came to an end. The only additions Mussolini could make to his empire would now be dictated by Hitler, who was too obsessed with destroying Russia to give a damn. What lessons can be learned from Italian fuck-ups almost a century ago? The mere possession of overwhelming force, while not a negative, is not sufficient for military victory. Of greater importance is the possession of leaders capable of utilizing such force intelligently and decisively. This lesson, while it may seem obvious, has either been lost on or has never been learned by many important figures in the modern world. When Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Russian dictator, along with many Western analysts, expected Ukrainian defeat within days based on little more than the fact that Russia is big and Ukraine is small. Whether Ukraine's future lies in the freedom promised by the West or the extermination promised by the Kremlin remains to be seen, but that future cannot be determined merely by which side holds more stuff. Italy expected to win in Egypt for the same faulty reasoning Russia expected to win in Ukraine. While I doubt that bigger number theory will ever die, hopefully your perspective on it has changed for the better. I'm the Counterfactor, and thanks for watching.
Big bang bang roll, got cheat codes. Certified in the hood, boy, they all know. Don't be asking y'all that you gotta know to know. Got a pocket full of cash, so the whole boat. See, I've been thugging since a young and I ain't got a bang. My name been ringing bells since I was like 14. Been service stacking from all of the dope fiends. And I ain't tripping, y'all could get it, you ain't get from me.